Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. Today I'm chatting with Dr. Mark McBride-Wright, a pioneering figure in the world of engineering and a champion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mark's contribution to fostering inclusivity have earned him prestigious accolades, including the Rook Award from the Royal Academy of Engineering in 2022 and the Member of the Order of the British Empire in 2023. As you can see, he's not just an engineer. He's a man making a profound impact on the future of the engineering industry as a whole. He currently serves as a visiting professor of inclusive engineering leadership at University College London. He further brings his mission into the world as the founder of Equal Engineers, an organization dedicated to connecting diverse talent with inclusive employers, initiating the Equality in Engineering Conference, which has become a pivotal platform for driving conversations and change in the field of engineering, and co-founding Inner Engineering, a leading force in championing LGBTQ+ engineers. Mark personally identifies as a parent, as a gay man, and as a husband. I'm excited to talk with someone playing a big role in diversifying such a large and important field in our world. So let's welcome Mark, his own story, and his expertise into the new masculine. Thanks for joining me, Mark.
Pleasure to be here, Travis. Really excited about what we're going to chat about. I'm really delighted to be here on the New Masculine Podcast.
Oh, I'm excited to have you. Excited to have a Brit on the podcast. It's a nice little change up.
Not just a Brit, you've got a Scottish Brit here. So I will try and make sure I enunciate and I'm clear in my articulation.
Yeah, don't try too hard. It's part of the charm. It's part of who you are.
Of course.
Is there anything else that you think people should know about you before we jump into this conversation?
I think you did a great job introducing me. I'm a chemical engineer by background, specialized in health and safety. And after working in industry for X number of years, found my passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I now sort of see myself as straddling those two professions.
I'm excited to have a conversation with you, and I think we'll get into it a little later, but diversity, equity, and inclusion is such a touchy topic right now. I know it is in the US, at least. We're kind of reflecting on this wokeism and the DE&I efforts. And I'm excited to pull you out on it because I think that both of us really value the efforts of DE&I, and yet we're in a sort of intense time around it. So maybe we can get into that as we get into our conversation.
Definitely. And I will pepper throughout our conversation a whole bunch of engineering analogies that I usually use to convey DEI concepts. So it might need a little bit more pre-explanation on my part, but I'll do my best.
Beautiful. Excited to hear how those analogies come through. Before we get into all of that, I'd love to hear your own story as a man. I think many of my listeners really like to hear about who you are and the journey you've been on, stepping from boyhood into manhood. And so share with me any of the sort of stories or times in your life that come to mind when you think about like really important developmental moments for you growing up from a boy and learning to be a man in your culture.
Yeah, that's a big question.
It is a big question.
So I'm 35, so I was born in 1988. In the United Kingdom, this was in the sort of shadow of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government that had brought in legislation that really moved rights for the LGBTQ community backwards. It was something called Section 28 that made it illegal to talk about homosexuality in schools. So my early years growing up through the 90s and maturing in the early noughties, well, maturing, becoming a young adult in the teenager in the early noughties, all of that was done with male role models that were in the shadow of that past, of that legislation, and what that was creating culturally in the environment. So looking back on it, it's interesting connecting to even the label being a man, like masculinity, men. I almost associate my sex, being a male, with the heteronormativity that comes around with the label being a man. And I guess now that men's work is starting to be more of a thing and I'm more interested in it, it's like I feel like I'm just starting to explore my own masculinity more through the work that I'm doing. But anyway, to answer your question, growing up as a gay man, or someone who knew I was different but didn't necessarily know I was gay, I guess my sexuality and my sex were very correlated in that sense of feeling different, feeling othered. And because you didn't see much around, positive portrayal of gay couples or gay people on TV or in the media, I just knew that I wasn't what was being portrayed: into football, hyper masculine, getting into fights at school, having all the girlfriends, etc., etc. The sort of stereotype that can come around. It wasn't so much of a stereotype, but it's actually quite a lot of people were like that when I went to school. So I always felt different, and I've kind of carried that with me, to be honest, into adulthood. And I find it hard to look back on those years growing up to separate the two. I think if you're in the closet growing up, that just dominates your sense of being in terms of your sex, your gender, as well. It's hard to decouple the two, I find.
Well, even just your development as a human being, at least in my experience, it dominated my development, and in some ways forced me to underdevelop parts of myself because I was afraid to step forward and be seen. And it caused me to try to overdevelop other parts of myself as a human being so I could gain acceptance and belonging, or try to hide or mask what I was afraid of.
I do wonder if I have been that as well. It does, in this kind of constant pursuit that I have for excellence and being the best at what I do, and just trying to create more light in the world. I do wonder. I've heard that gay men, as you've said, often overcompensate for other areas in our lives where we felt some source of shame or some source of negativity that we haven't gone back and explored. I read a really good book, actually, by and I've heard a lot of gay men have read this book, and it's really helped them. By the author's called Matthew Todd, and he used to be the executive editor of Attitude. It's a really big, I think it's one of the UK's biggest gay magazines, gay publications. And Matthew in the books talks about the straitjacket, uses the metaphor of being in a straitjacket, and he talks about the source of addiction as adults is usually because we've got a whole lot of undealt with trauma that we bring with us into adulthood. And this for gay men, a lot of this step from the 80s and 90s, this stems back from lack of acceptance and shame. So when I read that in my context and thought backwards on my life, I was privileged to some extent. You know, I never had any sort of extremely negative experiences, like I was, you know, shunned from my family or sent to the hills to, you know, never see anyone again. But I do remember growing up and thinking, I will not be accepted and I will have to leave. Mm-hmm. Like I remember having those thoughts as sort of a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, thinking, what I see ahead of me, that isn't me. And I didn't know that I was gay. I knew I was different. And I was sort of just starting to realize that I was attracted to men, I guess. But yeah, just that leaves an indent, doesn't it? A sort of a mark on you, thinking that you have to move away to be accepted. And really, I just sort of see myself as being on just the right side of a sea change in equalities legislation. Literally, when I moved to London when I was 17, met my boyfriend at the time, and he's now my husband, 10 days after moving there. Cherie Blair, the wife of our former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, I remember watching her on TV hosting a reception in 10 Downing Street to celebrate the launch of the UK Civil Partnership Act. So this was the act that allowed, you know, gay people to have their relationship status legally recognised. So I had just met my first boyfriend and started going out at a point in time where my status as a couple could be recognised. We could get protection, and you know, if we wanted to get hitched. So yeah, I feel lucky to have been on the right side of history in terms of moving into my formative years, and that being a really stable foundation. But you know, one's relationship with one's father. I remember the night I came out. Now, my parents had me when they were quite young. You know, my mum was 16, my dad was 18. So there's not that big an age gap. Mm-hmm. And, you know, but my dad handled it well. He handled it all right. You know, I think when something like, it's funny, isn't it? It's like this big secret that we have to share. And that's where it's rooted in shame, isn't it? It's like, where's the celebration? You know, where's the streamers and the party poppers? I'm having a coming out party rather than the doomsday announcement, you know? But in retrospect, you know, my dad's sort of was concerned for, you know, my life just being a bit more difficult than had I been straight, you know, because again, coming back to that context, we didn't have a Labour government at the time. We still had this illegal to even talk about homosexuality in schools around the place. So that was still propagating real negativity in the press. I remember there was a big, I don't know if they were famous in the US. I'm sure they were. Boyzone. They were a big band over here. They're a boy band, a UK boy band. And one of their members, Stephen Gately, he was gay, but he got outed by one of the tabloid newspapers. And I remember, I was in primary 3. So I must have been about 6 or 7. And I remember listening to the radio and the morning breakfast show and the presenters just being incredibly homophobic in today's world, you know. And because I sort of knew that what he was, deep down, I must have known that who he was, because he passed away, unfortunately. It was representative of who I am. It just again felt this feeling of, you're not going to belong here in the future. So, you know, it's no surprise that there's such high suicidal ideation and self-harm rates in our community, because, you know, if you haven't got the resilience and if you haven't got the positive reaction from your core foundation, no wonder it sends you off in another direction. But no, overall, it's been okay.
Yeah, I think about, like, you were sharing about sort of like growing up in the shadow of a conservative movement that really didn't even create space for people to exist or acknowledge their existence. I also think about you and I both being products of the mid to late 80s, that we also grew up in the shadow of the AIDS crisis and everything that was taught all the fears that were created during that time frame, all of the loss of human life during that time frame. And I always think about like neither of us had to grow up in the acute part of it. But what are the implications of growing up knowing you're different and finding out that you are associated with this thing that either your government is telling you that you can't talk about, or that people are afraid of because of a disease that's moving through. And so it's like, how do you, like, I always wonder about like, what are the ramifications on those of us that didn't navigate the intensity of it, but what the ramifications and the shadow side of it on the other side of it?
I think we are the bridging generation, you know, to those that had gone through it, that did live through it, to the young people coming through now that have no reference point to overt discrimination, lack of protections. You know, maybe it is a bit different in parts of the US than it is here. At least we do here in the United Kingdom have by law protection legally and against discrimination everywhere. But you know, so it affects your core foundation. You know, I watch. You know, I've had to upskill myself in my gay history and learn about the history of our community. And I think they are really important stories that need to be kept alive and passed on. So when we become the elders of the community, we can pass the knowledge on to how it used to be to those coming behind us. And I think it's about capturing those stories, you know, making sure they are locked away in a time capsule, so to speak, you know, so that they can be revisited. That's one of the reasons why, you know, podcasts like this are so important, because you can capture at a moment in time a snapshot of someone's experience, and then that recording can exist forever, you know?
Yeah, and as you were saying, like in different parts of the US, it's a little bit different. And I think that there is sort of a major slide towards, and we'll talk, and this is kind of plays into the conversation around the DE&I stuff, is like there is sort of this inclination to this pendulum swinging backwards a little bit, and this removing of rights, or this trying to undo sort of the federal or the legal protections against that are for certain groups that have been marginalized or victimized in many times of the year. So it is important for us to remember these stories, because we already know where this can go.
Yeah, but this is to your point there about the pendulum, and that was going to be one of my engineering analogies there. This is my first time in a kind of swing back moment in terms of March for Equity and March for Equality. Because as I said, bright-eyed 17-year-old Mark arriving in London in 2005 off the train at King's Cross Station, the world was very different. We had the London 2012 Olympics 7 years later, full of promise and inspiring the next generation. But since then, we've just become more and more to the right side of politics, more toxic, more divided, and absolutely that pendulum that swings forward. When it swings too far forward in one direction, majority groups perceive there to have been too much equity and opportunity given out. The brakes come on and we start to swing back. And that's exactly what we're seeing in these movements globally for the trans community, for women's rights. And the key for us as social justice activists, advocates, is to not let us swing back too far from our original starting point, such that we've moved fully backwards.
I'd love to hear more about now, like you've shared a little bit about your story growing up and your journey. Now that you're a married person, now that you have children, I'd love to hear about like the kind of work you're doing currently around you said that you were just starting to look at your own masculinity and like kind of reflect on it. Like, what's it like now for you?
Yeah, totally. So I never thought I'd be a dad, you know? I remember thinking growing up, maybe I should just stay in the closet, you know, try and marry my childhood sweetheart, you know, my best friend from school. And then it would be really easy, come out later on in life and have some kids. And, oh my goodness. Like, and that's the way a lot of people must have felt back in the day, to just suppress feelings, compartmentalize, and then live two lives, one in vice and one in open fakeness, I guess. So I remember thinking, being 15 when I came out to my immediate family and close friends, and then 17 when I came out fully to everyone and didn't really give a crap who knew. I remember thinking, well, I'm now making a choice that I'm probably not going to have a family. But yeah, I mean, things moved on. My husband and I thought about it. We thought seriously about it. We went to an adoption evening to find out more information. And it was ran by the LGBT network at Goldman Sachs, the big bank. And it was just all a bit too polished and glitzy. I was like, this doesn't feel, this feels a bit fake. So I ended up going to a local council one, like one with the local adoption network. And that felt much more raw, much more like the real deal, like how it would be. And I remember walking into this room and all the chairs being lined up in a circle. And there was a whole lot of straight couples, and then me. It was just me. My husband couldn't make it. And it just felt too much for me. I just didn't feel ready for it. You had a lot of straight couples where this was their only chance to have a child, because they tried IVF and etc. etc. And so I left that. I remember phoning my gran, actually. I left that session feeling, why, just because I'm gay, do I think that I have to do adoption as the only option? We are privileged enough to possibly be able to afford surrogacy. So maybe we should explore that. Maybe we should give it a shot. And well, that just set off a whole new direction in life, chain of events. We investigated doing the US route. We compared it against the route in the United Kingdom. We decided to go for the route in the United Kingdom first, because it's much more cost effective and means we could be around more for medical appointments and everything. And yeah, I mean, we were very lucky. It was plain sailing. It was difficult. It was hard. But we found a surrogate chose us quite quickly. It's the way it works. It's a bit different over here. We found an egg donor, and we were lucky with creating embryos and embryo transfers working first time. Each time our surrogate was willing to carry for us twice. So I've got a son and a daughter. So it's just been absolutely magical. So in terms of like exploring my masculinity, like having that label as Dada, it's a name that I never thought I would be called. But it's really funny now, being a parent, how you reach back into your upbringing with that toolkit your parents must have used to raise oneself. But you have to like pick the good bits and filter out the bits that probably wouldn't fly nowadays.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm loving it. I'm loving, my mix of being a dad, meeting other dads, like understanding the world of gender equality, but in the other direction. Because in parenthood, it is the other way around. In my world as an engineer, we're all about getting more women into engineering, and it's a male-dominated profession, and it's too masculine and blah, blah, blah. In the world of parenthood and raising babies, it is so skewed towards women. It is unreal. And when you go through that from a pre-education perspective, and then actually having children, being in the hospital and dealing with healthcare professionals, etc., the bias is massive towards women. It is huge. So when it comes to like straight couples, heterosexual couples, when they've had kids, you can sort of start to see the foundations of where diversion is at risk of happening. and maybe why a confidence gap starts to creep in with birth mothers then being reluctant to return to the workplace, and fathers feeling disconnected from their kids because they haven't had enough time off to actually bond. It's we were lucky that we took off the right amount of time from work. I'm self-employed, so I just didn't take on any projects for 6 months or whatever, and just created space for us to really become a family with my firstborn, and then with our secondborn. Well, she was born 6 weeks before the pandemic lockdown, so we were forced into hibernation altogether. But that is one area that I really find fascinating, exploring masculinity and fatherhood. So, for example, if you want to go and change a nappy or a diaper, if you want to go and change a diaper, it's better now, but even back in 2018 when my son was born, male toilets did not have changing facilities.
Mm-hmm.
So I was unapologetic. I was like, well, if there's no changing facility, I'm going to the women's toilets. I ain't changing my kid on the floor or whatever. And yeah, I just raised it. If I was never, I mean, it only happened like maybe 3 times. So I'm making it sound worse than it was, but it just shows you when it comes to designing facilities, there's just an assumption that it's the woman that has the child. Even when it comes to parent-child parking spaces, I've noticed now pictures starting to depict just a stick figure with a buggy. Before, it used to be a stick figure that had a triangle for a skirt.
Oh, I haven't seen that shift.
It used to be that's where you get the heteronormativity then coming in. You get the stick figure man, stick figure woman, and then the buggy. So it's fascinating. All these, you see it everywhere. So yeah, and it's happened. I've been triggered a few times in public spaces. Once at a airport here in London when I was traveling with the 2 kids, and then the airport security. A moment came to be that we were sort of separated from one another. I was still over at the baggage belt, putting all the laptops and iPads and separating everything out. My husband had gone through the scanner with the 2 kids, and the female security guard just looked up and was like, "Oh, so where's mum?" And my husband was sort of a bit flabbergasted, didn't really know how to respond. I come through and we figure it out, but there's just in that moment, our kids were like 1 and 3. And we hadn't really introduced the concept of their origin yet. I mean, they knew they were different, obviously, having 2 dads versus a mum and a dad. But there's so much going through my brain in that moment in terms of how do I respond. I mean, I ended up just correcting her, and she apologized, and you could tell in her face she was like, "Oh, goodness, what I said." The irony is that the airport is one of my clients. So safe to say,
more work to do.
Well, they got some training. They got some security training shortly after that experience. I made a diplomatic comment about it on LinkedIn, and I knew my good friend, key point of contact there, would be in touch. Within 10 minutes, I had a text from her. "Mark, I'm so sorry, blah, 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 blah."
Oh, that's great. Well, and I think it's really interesting because I think that people who have never lived an experience like being a gay man, like for heterosexual men out there, it's hard to really imagine those little moments in life that happen over time. And it kind of works in 2 different directions. Like only having the changing stations in a woman's restroom puts a lot of pressure and a lot of responsibility on women and the mother to do in a heterosexual relationship, to do most of the labor when it comes to child rearing. And so what is it? Continue to reinforce and teach people in the world about who holds those responsibilities. And then it happens on the other side when there is no female in the relationship. What does that do for those of us that don't fit the heteronormative relationship style? And so there are some interesting messages that I think are really worth reflecting on and confronting about what are we teaching just in our systems that we set up. And it sort of makes sense why those systems were set up initially. And yet that doesn't mean we can't evolve as our society evolves, as our what our families look like evolve as people are given more space to be themselves, like themselves authentically. I think that there's so much room for us to evolve those things without it needing to be an attack on the majority or taking things from the majority.
Definitely. And it's incumbent upon my industry to start helping foster some of those changes, you know, design practices for building new facilities or doing retrofit on, you know, restaurants or whatever, you know. If you're doing demolition and rebuilding something new, or you've got a new spec to design a brand new facility, if we're just cookie cuttering and copying and pasting designs from the past and making little tweaks to make it compliant with modern legislation, that isn't going to be the most effective way to embed good practice on diversity and inclusion. So this is why having diverse teams are really important in the design process. So you've got more places, more experience and perspectives that you can pull from to bring to that piece of work that you're doing, and also create a culture where people are more likely to challenge and to stand up and feel psychologically safe and call out non-inclusive designs before they even get to production. And then the last thing you want is a customer giving a bit of feedback that your product doesn't work, and it's something that should have been picked up in the early stages. I think most might be, well, if you're not familiar with the example, there's a video on YouTube that went viral during the pandemic. It was a soap dispenser. I think it was in the US somewhere. And the soap dispenser didn't work under black skin. It only dispensed soap under white skin.
Oh, wow.
So it was to do with like the light reflecting off the skin and the you know, I mean, talk about systemic racism. There you go.
Yeah, I think there was like initially when the first Apple Watches came out too, they weren't reading certain skin tones also, like because it uses light and the way that it wasn't sort of algorithmically calculated to work with different colors of skin, and how the system like that is like, whoa, like even a product like a watch can point out your difference and can point out and can be ineffective for you because of your skin tone.
Yeah. And being a white man, I'll never know that experience unless we are intentional and curious about finding out about the experiences of people who are non-white, people who are black.
It makes sense why you are focusing your work on, like, as an engineer, why you want to bring in this sort of diversity, equity, inclusion mindset, because as you were pointing out, like, engineering is where things begin, where our systems and our structures begin. And so we need to catch these things at the start rather than waiting until they're already built and we recognize that they're faulty in some way.
Absolutely. Yes.
Tell me a little bit more about your journey from being a chemical engineer into diversity, equity, inclusion work.
Yeah, sure. So I was working in industry, and I got very interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion when I attended an event focused on women in engineering, cisgendered women in engineering. And I felt like this is something I'd like to get involved with to advocate for. You know, this is quite interesting. But I quickly felt a bit disconnected because being a gay man, I never saw anything that represented who I was, that was advocating for sexual orientation, gender identity. I went to Pride in London, I think, a few months later. And again, absolutely no engineering businesses, just nothing. So coincidentally, about the same time, there was an event that was run by the Royal Academy of Engineering, looking at sexual orientation and gender identity in the workplace. And I went to it, and I'd say it sounds a bit cheesy, but it's probably the closest I've ever got to feeling a moment of transcendence. When people say they feel like they found their calling, like in that moment, in that event, I felt compelled. I felt like something needs to happen from this 2.5 hours of how I've spent my life. This was about 2013. it can't just be a bunch of slides that are put on a website and then some good practice guidance coming out of it. I'm like, we need to create something. So I created a handle on Twitter, LGBT engineer, I think it was. And then someone else who'd been at the event created a blog. What's it like being a gay engineer? We noticed one another's activity. And so we then got together and a group of us ended up co-founding Inter Engineering to connect, inform, and empower LGBTQ plus engineers and supporters. And that's when things just really started to take off. I found my side hustle, my passion project. I used to do it on the side of my day job. We grew the network to have 6 regional groups across the United Kingdom. We grew it to over 1,500 members. We had corporate sponsorship. We had Pride in London. We've been in Pride in London every year since for the last 10 years. We've really helped empower organizations to place more emphasis on LGBTQ issues in STEM. We've been the support organization for the growth in big companies like Airbus. It was our work that helped the early founders of the Pride at Airbus network actually create it and build up the confidence to lobby internally to get leadership buy-in to actually do more as a business. And I mean, now they use their influence internationally to advocate. I think they pushed back when the Indian government wanted to recriminalize homosexuality in 2015 or 16. I can't get my dates right. Airbus, being a big employer in a particular area, stepped in and said, no, this is not acceptable. We won't tolerate this, So to think that the thing that you've started has had that scale of influence in terms of a domino effect is incredible. So that's where I found my rainbow stripes for diversity in engineering. But knowing that we were going to do surrogacy and start a family, I wanted to create a more flexible lifestyle for myself. So I started thinking about going into business for myself, and I really didn't want to do technical safety engineering. I really wanted to do diversity as a consultant. But the irony was that I wasn't experienced enough. I didn't have a HR qualification, accreditation, so I tried going for interviews. I got through to the final stages in a couple, but didn't get the job. But was told to keep at it because you do have potential. So I managed to land my first training contract with a client. And the irony was that being a chartered engineer was the thing that really helped successful delivery of the training to the engineers, because I'm one of them. So I sort of played affinity bias to my benefit, being like, hey, I ain't some HR professional that's now going to come in and tell you you've all got to love one another. I'm an engineer. I've got CEng after my name. So using that white male privilege in that setting where they're all white males, I could peel the onion back layer by layer and choose to share my vulnerabilities as a gay man, as someone who grew up from a working class background, having to have support to go to university and so on and so forth. So that was what set up the foundations for what is now my business, Equal Engineers. And the theme of masculinity that runs through Equal Engineers was born out of the discovery of the male suicide rates in the engineering, manufacturing, and construction sectors. And that's why I continue to do what I do in that area.
What are you finding as somebody that's working and influencing within the field of engineering? I hear, when I reflect on what I know about the field of engineering, I have seen a lot more push towards women in STEM fields. And so there's been a huge sort of movement in that direction. And I think it's brilliant and wonderful and important. And I also hear that you found that there was a gap in also the sort of queer people, the LGBT people that were stepping into these fields that were also a part of the inclusion and diversity of the field that was important. As you've stepped forward as a gay man leading these diversity, equity, and inclusion elements in the field that you're in, What are some of the major roadblocks you're running into, or the major challenges in your field that you'd love to sort of influence and continue to dismantle?
Yeah. Well, oh,
Oh, I'm getting you all fired up now.
where to begin? Where to begin? I think as I ascend and mature in my career and have more influence because I have a successful track record as a impactful entrepreneur growing a business that's making evidential change in certain pockets. I am at a crossroads right now where I'm thinking, how do we maximize the impact and scale our impact in a way that affects it goes as deep as possible to where it needs to go. So to directly answer your question, one of the areas that I think we have successfully made the case now that diversity, equity, inclusion is something that, irrespective of whether you believe it or not, is something that is going to be taken seriously and a part of core business as this century progresses. It's good for business. It's something that the generation coming behind us, Gen Z and then Gen Alpha after that, are going to hold high in their value set. And therefore, culturally, our organizations need to welcome that. Otherwise, we're not going to have anyone to work for us. People will vote with their feet in terms of where they want to apply their labor skills, and they'll go work in industries that are inclusive, that value who they are, that lets them bring their whole self to work, that doesn't mean they have to mask, cover, and hide and allocate energy to just projecting something different, and that embraces their mental health from a positive perspective. I think that is now common ground. I do still meet leaders that either do not believe that to be the case, but I think that number is going down as I am in front of more leaders. I think leaders in our age bracket are now starting to move up through the ranks. And again, coming back to being this bridging generation, we typically have a more egalitarian outlook on equity and know how, I'd like to think we know how to use our privilege to the advantage. So I'm seeing that in a new kind of early career leader. People who've just moved into the senior leader ranks, but they're on the bottom rung. They know they want to make change, but they are struggling to see how to make it. And they're still existing in a majority white organizational context across the entire engineering sector. There's barely any women at the top levels of engineering and STEM in general. So I think offering coaching and support to these male leaders to give them space to share what they feel scared to ask, because, in the pendulum of equality, when you go so far in your social justice movement to make people feel scared to ask questions or to be curious, they don't feel psychologically safe to do that. So therefore, we never have the conversation. They keep quiet. They stay silent. And therefore, we have apathy, no understanding of other people's issues. And we're not then shifting people onto that allyship continuum where they're then proactively going out of their way to learn about the lived experiences of identities which they are not, to secure learned experience over lived experience alongside their own lived experience. And that is what I see as a sort of core foundation to the body of my work. It's press and pause, getting the white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, neurotypical male engineer that represents the majority of our profession, getting them to dig deep internally to think about a moment in time where they themselves have maybe felt excluded, and to revisit that emotion, bring it to the surface, and to then recognize that some other groups experience that feeling more often in the context of their workplace. And the fact that they're privileged as a white male, they maybe have to dig a bit deeper to uncover some of that stuff. Or some of the stuff's already at the surface, because guess what? you are having to mask, cover, and hide whatever it is that you're going through at home. So I don't think men actually have to dig that deep, to be honest, because we have to mask and cover and be macho and show that we've got it together. We cannot cry. So I actually think men don't have to dig that deep to find these barriers and these issues. They're just not correlating what these barriers and issues are and being open about them to that being the state that an inclusive culture would create. And I think when you're able to make that, that's what I'm trying to work on, is helping people make that leap to think, I feel included in my organization's journey on diversity, equity, inclusion. It's not just about people who are not me. It's also about me. And I think that trying to then, when you're in that frame, manage then the tensions that come up when different groups are offering X, Y, and Z. That's the thing that a lot of DEI practitioners get wrong. We are in our highway of who we are and doing the work that we do, and we think that everything in DEI is about getting people to change their attitude, to come over to the other side and be for the good. You're never going to change people at their core. That DEI, an inclusive environment, is a psychologically safe environment. It's where you can speak up without fear of retribution, where you can genuinely say, without feeling threat to your career or your position, what you think. You're not impacted by a hierarchy. And so there's an inclusive leader is someone who can curate that tension. Is actually a tense environment where people can say what they think and share what they're feeling, but not at the expense of making someone else feel devalued or hindering their career progressions or quenching, their opportunity. And I think where we need to explore further are some of those tension points in DEI. Religion and sexual orientation. It's a classic one, subsets of religion, it's going to come up anywhere. I was with a client yesterday, a few days ago, a prospect, and they're indirectly being affected by the war in Gaza, in Israel, because they have Palestinian employees and they've had some Jewish clients, and never before any of this did they even think that this would be an issue, in their workplace. So events that are happening thousands of miles away are starting to affect culture here within that particular organization. So you can't have your blinkers on. You have to have your eyes open as a leader and be curious about leading below the surface, thinking about how others are thinking and trying to be one step ahead. I almost imagine it being like a radar. You're there physically and mentally you're there as well, but you're also tuning in to the body language of the room, the what's not being said in specific conversations. You're anticipating how someone may feel, and then stepping in to make them feel better if you think they might feel excluded. And you can only do that if you've got a diverse frame of reference. And well, we're wired as humans to not proactively seek out diversity. We surround ourselves by people that are like us, and that feeds our inner circle, our trusted 10. And we're skewed. We have to really break the mold and proactively seek out diverse perspective. When I set up Inter Engineering, I didn't knowingly know any trans people. None. I only knew what I'd seen on TV, what I'd read in newspapers, and transphobic comments that had been made in the playground or by, family or friends, whatever. So when I was setting up an organization to help part of a community, I had to find people. So I went to networking events. I listened to panel discussions. I reached out to some people who kindly shared their story with me. And so I moved from that position of apathy into, being aware of the issues and the frame of reference of a few people. So much so that I now feel like I can be an advocate for for the needs of the community, because I know loads of trans people.
Yeah, you're so right that there is a sort of like unconscious human survival thing that is about choosing sameness as a form of safety. Like we are drawn to things that we are comfortable with, that we know, that look like us, that are similar enough that we feel safe, and we are psychologically threatened or lose safety as we choose difference, as we come against difference. And so I think you're right that we have to consciously choose to find the difference and immerse ourselves in that and explore that, even though it may feel uncomfortable at different times. All that you said was just really beautifully said. And I actually wanted to thank you for the way you framed it, because I learned something earlier as you were sharing in this, is that the way I kind of framed up my question was like, what are the hurdles or the things you need to confront or dismantle still in the field of engineering? And you answered it so much more aligned with how I choose to bring my work into the world. And I didn't even see where I was still in the confrontation, in the fight, in the trying to convince. And I think there is a role for those who play the confrontational role, that those who call out what's not going well, that point that stuff out, that make a loud sound. I think there is absolutely a role for it. I also know myself to value psychological safety and to be the person on the other side of that, calling it out, that's actually doing the work to not just call it out, but to do the work to bring others along in it. And I was using the language of like dismantle or confront. And there was something that I heard in you when you were talking about sort of the younger leaders who are stepping into leadership for the first time, but at the lower levels. You were talking about sort of empowering and nurturing the questions they want to ask or the things that they may want to bring into the organization. That's a completely different tactic than confrontation and dismantling. To nurture and to empathize with their experience and to allow them to step forward and empower them as a leader. That's such a different tactic. And I really value that. And I really appreciate how you framed that up, because it brought me back into alignment with my own sense of how I do my work and how I try to bring DE&I stuff into the world, that's where I can make the biggest impact, not necessarily the dismantling and confrontational element of the other side of things.
I absolutely agree. You need both. You know, you wouldn't have had the social justice movement of gay rights that we've had if you didn't have people out on the streets,
for sure,
marching and being what I call the thorn in the side for those in power. But you also need the people at the heart of organizations to then help make the mechanics of that change work. And I that's why I call myself an advocate, a social justice warrior activist by stealth. You know, I like working with the clients that need to make the change and hold them accountable to do that.
Yeah, it's like how I hold this conversation. I think it's been really important that toxic masculinity has been called out in our cultures and has been pointed out and has been looked at. And yet I don't use that language in my conversations because I don't feel like I can embed enough psychological safety into the conversation that we can actually evolve and change and grow. And so it's important to hold up a mirror, to see what's really in front of us. And I think some people just do that better than I do. And there also needs to be, on the other side, those of us that are in the system being willing to embed enough psychological safety for real change and growth to happen as well.
I'm, you know, because men are like the most represented in engineering, I never thought I'd get into men's work. And I think I can feel that there's a pull happening within me, that it is probably an area I'm going to spend some time in next year, a book coming out and the focus of it. And I'm really excited for that. And I remember reading about the podcast and reading like how you frame it and you know, the use of the word toxic and what have you. So you're given out in a space that I'm new to in that respect, that I'm learning in. So I love your work. I've been learning a lot from male thought leaders in this space that do men's work. Shine spotlight on masculinity. So it's it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, thank you for that. You kind of alluded to the fact you've got a book coming out. I'd love to, as we're kind of coming to the end of our conversation, hear a little bit more about the book.
It's gone so fast.
I know.
I feel like we're just getting started.
I know.
Yes, yeah. So, new book coming out. Well, a book coming out. My first one. It's called Engineering Inclusive Cultures, Masculinity, Mental Health, and a New Model of Safety in STEM. I explore the history of safety in engineering and look at how we can take some learnings from that and apply it to psychological safety, apply it to masculinity. We'll look at how can engineering maybe present a model for a male majority workforce, which has a male majority workforce. How can it provide as a model for change that other industries might be able to pick up some advice in there? So it's quite a technical book in that respect. It's got some theory in it. It's got some frameworks. Every engineer loves a good framework. So does every diversity practitioner, actually. Everyone loves a 4-letter acronym that makes a word.
Any corporate environment loves a good framework. Yeah. The human mind seems to love a good framework.
So I'm offering my shield and shake frameworks that are in the book, but will be out next February 2024.
By the time this conversation's out, it might be out already, which is exciting because then people will be listening and will maybe get interested and want to purchase the book.
That would be hugely appreciated. I am planning a US book tour for National Engineers Week, which is the 18th to the 24th of February. So I'll be visiting some universities in the northeast of the US, sort of planning a little route from Boston down to New York, down to DC. But I'm really interested to do more work in the US. I think there's so many similarities, but also differences to the United Kingdom, and I'm really looking forward to hopefully kicking off some work over there potentially by launching the book in the US.
Yeah, well, I'm cheering you on in this sort of knowledge that next year has some of that sort of men's work involved in it for you, that part of you that wants to dive a little deeper into this, the work that you've already been doing around that to include masculinity as a part of the book that you've written, to start to, for the first time in your life, really reflect on your own masculinity and what it means. I'm cheering you on in all of that. And in your success, you bring, I love how you formatted some stuff. And I love that even in this conversation, I find myself to be pretty aware of the DE&I space, but I even learned something in talking to you and helped me come into better alignment with myself as I hear you sharing your perspective on how you bring your work into the workplace. So I really appreciate that. If there's one piece of advice you'd like to leave men with who are listening to this episode, what might that be?
I would say, don't always feel like you're part of the majority. Understand your own diversity story to your core and know that there are elements of you and your experience that you can bring to the surface, share, and then others, and that includes other men, will learn from that as well. So if you're willing to lower the guard a bit and be vulnerable and share some things, that'll help your mental health and it'll help the mental health of others around you. And I think if more of us as men are doing that, it might help drive down some of these high suicidal ideation and suicide rates that I've described already.
Yeah. It takes those of us who are willing to be vulnerable and step forward into conversations like this to start, and then it gives permission to others. And I think that isolation and not sharing and not being vulnerable is what's driving a lot of that mental health crisis and suicidal ideation and completion in male society. And so I think that is sort of the antidote, and at least a step in the direction towards changing the direction that our mental health is going as men. So thank you for offering that. If people wanted to find out more about your work, wanted to buy a future copy of the book as it's out, how do they go about finding you and your work in the world?
Sure. So if your listeners visit my my business's site, equalengineers.com, that's equalengineers.com, then there'll be information on there about our broad array of services and also some more information on the book.
Okay, great. I'll make sure that's in the show notes so people can easily find it. If people want to connect with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Travers03. And if you're interested in becoming a contributor to the podcast, you can follow me on Patreon and make a contribution there. That's at patreon.com/pseudomasculine. Thanks again for joining me, Mark. And until our next episode.